Just turn it back on. Okay. If you were monetizing a resource, let's say that you're in coal mining. Is coal a stock limited or a flow limited resource?
Not familiar with those terms.
Stock limited?
Hmm?
Stock limited?
Why stock limited?
Because you can stock it up. Like, it won't go bad.
So it won't
Is
go
that
bad,
in-
but that's more the thing that makes it a commodity.
Okay. I'm not a economics person.
Can you make more coal?
Yes.
Why not?
No.
I mean, it takes millions of years.
It takes millions of years to generate coal. You have to have swamps, you have to have plants, they die. When they die, they don't get decomposed because they get covered by sediments. Those sediments get covered by more sediments until finally there's a lot of sediments on top of them. Then the pressure and the heat that is generated by all that weight bearing down on these plants basically convert those plants into coal. It's millions and millions and millions of years. So the coal that we dig out of the ground is all the coal we're gonna get, unless we want to wait millions and millions of years. And so it's a stock limited resource because there's a certain stock of it, and once that stock is gone, that's it. If you are trading in coal, you have to recognize that in your plan of how your business is going to go, because you know that there is going to come a point where you've mined all of the coal that is accessible to mine. At that point, you no longer have a job as a coal miner because there just isn't any coal. What are some other stock limited resources that we can think of?
Oil.
Hmm?
Oil?
Oil would be a stock limited resource.
Water.
Mm.
Fresh water.
Yeah, water is a stock limited resource. The nice thing about water is it can be cycled pretty efficiently if we think about it well, but ultimately there is a certain amount of water that is out there. Now, can you make water? How can you make water?
You combine hydrogen. and
Oh, but that's a
oxygen.
really energy expensive way of making water. There's a method of making water on the board, actually.
Oh, can you convert like the water in the air to actual? No. Okay.
Go ahead. So there's water floating around. in there.
Yeah.
Now, but that's already there. It's not being formed.
Oh,
from
okay.
anything. It's right behind me.
Cellular
That's not
respiration.
Oh, I erased it. I erased it. Sydney, what is it?
Cellular respiration.
You guys see the movie The Martian? Oh man, you guys
I think I have it.
Martian with Matt Damon? He is
Oh
stranded
yeah,
on
yeah,
Mars.
where he goes on Mars. Yeah.
He is
yeah.
stranded on Mars. What's one of the first things that he had to deal with? One of the first challenges that he had to overcome?
He was. Yeah.
No, before that, because you can live for quite a while without food. What you can't live very long without is
Water.
Water. So what did he do?
Oh yeah, didn't he like use the dew from the whatever he made like tents and then he realized dew or something like that?
Yeah, there is no dew.
There wasn't dew.
Mars.
Well, then
Mars
what was
doesn't
it
have
then?
water.
What was it then? Because it collected a bunch.
He
of
created
stuff.
a tent, and then what did he do inside of the tent?
Oh, heat? Did he create heat? No.
He created heat by
Exercise? No.
by lighting a fire. What did he burn?
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. I forgot.
He burned fuel from a spacecraft that got him there, had fuel in it, burned up that fossil fuel, went through the process of combustion. The outcome of combustion is always carbon dioxide and water. He did this in an enclosed space so that when carbon dioxide and water were formed, the water condensed on the plastic and then he harvested the water as it ran off the thing. So you can create water, but of course, what did you have to make glucose in the first place?
Energy.
Hydrogen and oxygen.
You had to have water in the first place. So yeah, we can effectively think of water as a stock limited sort of resource. Sydney mentioned oil. What are some other stock limited resources? Think beyond energy. So any fossil fuel is a stock limited resource. If the economy is tanking, what do you want to invest in before the economy tanks?
Land. Real estate.
Maybe, but you're gonna have to wait a while to get a return on that.
Gold
Gold, why?
is something that doesn't change with our economy.
Yeah, why not?
There's a limited amount.
It's a stock limited resource. It's not only a stock limited resource, but it's a stock limited resource that is relatively rare. And so as a result, it always has value. And what happens when an economy tanks is the value of gold goes up because people want to have a non-economy based sort of monetary device. And so people want gold more, and there's a limited supply for it because it's a stock limited resource, and so the price of gold goes up. And if you're holding cheap stock, cheap gold that you bought before the economy tanked and now it's selling at a much higher rate, you can actually sell off gold that you have and make a nice healthy profit.
So that's why during like the stock market crash, like there was all these gold companies popped up.
All these gold companies popped up wanting to buy your gold.
Buy your gold.
Buy your high school class ring. It's sad little 10-karat gold. Yeah, that's exactly why.
There's a bunch of them for a while.
Oh, yeah.
You don't see them as much anymore.
Because the economy's improved,
Yeah.
and people aren't worried about that anymore. What is a flow limited resource?
Something that like can be like recreated or not run out.
Okay, so it's a resource that doesn't have a limitation to the stock of it, but it only comes to you in little drips and drabs. So it's limited by not how much of it is there, but how much of it you can extract at a given moment. The sun is the classic flow limited resource. The sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar, or something like that. I don't know the words to the Annie song, but the sun will come out tomorrow. Now, there's gonna come a day when the sun goes supernova and obliterates the earth in the process, but that is millions and millions of years away. And so for us as humans in 2019, we can assume that the sun will come out tomorrow. But the problem with the sun coming out tomorrow is that while it comes out tomorrow, we're gajillions of miles away from the sun. And so of the total solar output that the sun outputs, we get a tiny fraction of that. Of that reaches the earth, we get a tiny fraction of that because of reflection off the upper surface of the atmosphere, scattering and absorption in the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes to us every day, but it comes to us in this little tiny stream. It's gonna come to us again tomorrow, but it's gonna be that same little tiny stream of energy. We're limited in terms of the energy that we have available to us by how quickly the sun comes to us, the solar energy comes to us from the sun. And that ultimately places an upper limit on how much of this we can support. We can only support as much of this as we get coming to us from sunlight. This is ultimately the economic crux of humans on the planet. When you think about economics, for those of you who are business majors, you can think of economics at really small scales, like the economics of a particular business, but you can also think about economics at very large scales. What are the things that ultimately limit the size of the global economy? How much economic activity can go on in the human endeavor? What's GDP?
Gross domestic product.
Gross domestic product. How do we measure that? What goes into the gross domestic product?
A lot of things.
Okay, thank you. Can you be more specific?
I'm not exactly sure, really.
Can you sum it up in a pithy sentence that you would give to your grandmother?
Does it have to do with how much money consumers spend?
Isn't it more like the money, the total money brought in through like imports and exports?
So it's made up of if you want to think of it, you can kind of bust it down into three components. So it's the sum total of the entire economic activity of a nation. And so in the case of the United States, it would include everything that we make as well as all service economies. So all of the money generated within the United States. And that includes money that is generated within the United States because it's just money changing hands between Americans, but it would also include the total amount of money that we make by selling goods and services to other countries. So it's
The
the
overall value?
Hmm?
Just the overall value?
It's just the overall value of the economy, how much money is generated in a given year by the American economy from both domestic activity as well as selling domestic products to overseas countries. So it's basically a measure of the size of the economy. And the federal government measures this every year, and we get updates quarterly on kind of how the GDP of the country is going. You hear this if you listen to business news. You guys listen to business news? How many of you are business majors? You dudes should be listening to business news. When people talk about the debt, if you ever hear economists interviewed when they're talking about the federal deficit and the federal debt load, what's the debt of the United States? It's trillions and trillions of dollars, but it's always talked about in terms of what fraction of that debt is it of the total gross domestic product. And you can sustain deficits and debt for quite some time as a nation, as long as it doesn't start to become too big a proportion of your gross domestic product. And we've kind of skated by in the United States for years of having relatively high levels of debt because we have the largest economy in the world. China is creeping up on us, but right now we still have the largest economy in the world as measured by gross domestic product. So you can think of gross domestic product as a nation's size economically, but you could also think about a world domestic product. How much total economic activity is going on if you look at the economies of every nation on the face of the planet. Ultimately, those, if you attempted to measure that, and some people have, that would represent the size of the economy. But all of that economic activity ultimately has a base in energy. I'm going to say that again. All of that economic activity ultimately has a base in energy. I'm going to leave this up because I still want to talk about this. Where do we get our energy?
Sun.
Hmm?
The sun.
So we get some of it from the sun. It turns out we get a small amount of energy from the sun. In terms of total energy consumption by humans, where do we get most of our energy as humans?
Food.
Okay, so we get our energy to power our bodies, but think about economics. Where do you get the energy to make a Toyota Prius?
Burning fossil fuels.
We get a lot of our energy from burning fossil fuels. When we use the term fossil fuels, what are we talking about?
Oil.
Oil, coal, natural gas, propane, all these things that we dig up and drill from the Earth's surface. Where did those things come from?
Earth's surface.
Hmm? Ultimately, where did these things come from? I described it for you earlier.
Organisms.
What kind of organisms?
Dead ones.
Dead.
Plants.
Yeah, I can see your lips pursed to make the P noise. So fossil fuels are just dead plants from millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. So when we say fossil fuels, what are we saying? It's just old solar energy that's been stored. As it turns out, fossil fuels are used to make fertilizer, used to plow the fields, it's used to harvest the crops. So a certain amount of our agriculture is also based on fossil fuels. which are basically just old photosynthetic products of plants that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. So, a lot of our economy is based on the burning of fossil fuels. So what will happen when fossil fuels run out? And they will, because they're all stock limited resources. Hmm?
We die.
You know, we don't have to die.
We are.
As of right now, we will.
If we do our human economies the way we do them right now, where they're heavily based on fossil fuels, it's not going to be good, and I'm glad that I'm going to be dead before this happens. I'm so glad I'm going to be dead before this happens. And I'm also glad that I didn't reproduce, because I would not want to wish this on my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. I think it's going to be really, really grim. Because we're not really taking into account the finite limits of stock limited energy sources. So what would we have to do to create a human economy in the absence of these stock limited energy resources?
We would have.
Noah, are you laughing or are you choking?
I was laughing.
What are you laughing at? Are you laughing at Dr. Lewinsky has taken us down this rabbit hole and we're supposed to be talking about food webs? I noticed that you're not taking any notes, so you must think this is all irrelevant.
No,
Sorry, what? No.
That's fair.
Okay. So when we ultimately run out of fossil fuels, which probably won't happen in my generation, it won't happen in your generation, but it might happen in the generation or two after yours. What's going to happen to human economies? What's going to be then the limit on human economic capacity?
The amount of energy we can produce.
Well, but we don't have any way of producing energy.
That'd be our limit, though.
Well, that's kind of our limit now. It's just that now we produce a lot of energy.
What was
Just keep going.
It's 5 of, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The amount of energy that we produce right now, we largely harvest from prior solar energy that's been stored in the form of coal and oil and natural gas and things like that. When we run out of those sources, what then becomes the limit of what we can do economically? Because our economy is ultimately driven by the amount of energy that we have to drive that economy. What then has to happen to the size of the human economy? Has to shrink. It has to shrink down to what?
Basically, because if you run out of energy.
Not nothing.
Shrinks down to the amount of energy you can produce.
How are you going to produce energy?
Through renewable energy resources.
So it would be through renewable energy. What renewable energy? What's the one renewable energy that we can depend upon?
The sun.
So ultimately, whatever little trickle of the sun that we get, that's the energy we're stuck with. And I've already talked to you about how that's really not a ton of energy. And so when it happens, and it will, human economies that are now really, really big, we're all living large on the landscape because we're living large on a bunch of stored energy that nature stored for us in the forms of fossil fuels. We're burning up way more energy. We're using way more energy than the sun gives us on a daily basis because we're getting that energy from someplace else. When that stored energy runs out, the only energy that we're going to have is the energy that is generated by the sun. Part of that is energy through photons coming to us from the sun, but part of that is just heat. Heat makes wind. One of the nice things about wind turbines is that wind is created when you have cool air in one place and warm air in another place, and that happens all the time on the surface of the earth. But the point is that there's going to come a point when we are going to be limited by, in terms of the energy that feeds the economy, we're going to be limited by the maximum number of photons that come to the earth. Yeah?
Is it true that the sun is like slowly getting closer to the earth? Is that
No,
no? Farther away maybe? Is it moving at all? Is that a thing? Or the earth is?
everything's moving.
Well, yes, but like, okay, never mind then.
Everything's moving relative to one another. The Earth does change its distance to the sun slightly over long periods of time. I'm not sure where we are in that wobble of the Earth right now. Those distances are so vast between us and the sun that little amounts of creeping towards the sun and away from the sun don't really make that big of a difference
Okay.
in terms of how much energy we get.
Got it.
Imagine that you are shooting a shotgun at a marble a mile away, and each of those shotgun pellets is a photon of light. And let's say that your shotgun was a super shotgun and it could shoot pellets a mile. Imagine the possibility of hitting the marble with one of those pellets. That's kind of how photons are coming to us from the sun. We're really, really, really far away from the sun, which is why we don't get a ton of energy to begin with, and then our atmosphere interferes with a lot of that light anyway, so we get a fraction of even that. So we're pretty far away. We're close enough to be warm, and we're not so far away that we're cold, so we're in this kind of what astronomers refer to as the Goldilocks zone. But in the grand scheme of things, we're still pretty far away. I have to deal with my evolution ecology students when we talk about seasonality. They think that the seasonality, a lot of them think that the seasonality is caused by the Earth getting closer to the sun and further away from the sun during the year. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't change its distance from the sun appreciably over the course of the seasons. What happens is that the Earth is rotating on an axis, 22.5 degrees, and so at some times of the year, the axis is parallel to the rays or perpendicular to the rays coming from the sun, and so everybody on the Earth is getting the same amount of sun. But then as the Earth continues to go around the sun, if the sun is here and the Earth is here, there are times when the axis is pointing away from the sun. That's when we're in winter and the southern hemisphere is in summer. Then it comes around to the spring equinox. The cant of the Earth is once again perpendicular to the rays of the sun. Everybody on Earth is getting the same amount of sun at the equinox, and then as it continues to come around, the northern hemisphere is pointed more towards the sun than the southern hemisphere is because of this axis. So we're not changing the distance between us and the sun, we're changing how the Earth is, how different parts of the Earth are tilted towards the sun or away from the sun, because we go around the sun in one plane and our axis of rotation is canted 22.5 degrees from that. So distance doesn't really make that big of a difference. Yes, it does wobble around a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's not.
But it's not getting closer.
Not getting-
significantly.
Not getting closer. And it's gotten closer as many times in the past as it's gotten further away.
Yeah.
People who study long-term geology can measure this in ways that I don't know or understand because I'm not a geologist. So ultimately, this is a food web showing energy relationships among these different organisms, and it shows these energy relationships, and it shows energy coming into the system and then energy being released to the system. That energy ultimately isn't stored within the system except for relatively short periods of time. And so you can only grow as much biomass, this is where I'm bringing home Noah, you can only create as much biomass on this 100 acres of pasture and 450 acres of forest as you have energy from the sun coming into the system. There is an ultimate limit to how many cows, how many chickens, how many rabbits, how many turkeys, how many hogs Joel Salatin can create, because he is ultimately limited by solar energy coming into the plants feed the rest of the system, and ultimately that energy gets lost in the form of heat. So energy is passing through this system, and his productivity is limited by the daily input of solar energy coming from the sun. Yeah, question?
Okay, is water also a way we can harvest energy? Is that separate from the sun, or is that like the same thing? cause don't we produce like?
Oh, we produce
conveyors?
hydroelectric energy, but if you think about hydroelectric energy, where does that water come from? Well, that water comes from evaporation of water off the surface of the ocean. That water goes up into the clouds.
So it's-
Clouds sometimes just rain on the ocean, but sometimes clouds come onto land. When they come onto land, they come into contact with mountains. As they go up mountains, it cools and it rains on land. That water that rains at the top of the mountains through gravity goes down. We build reservoirs that then trap that water in reservoirs. That reservoir represents a big stockpile of energy that we then shunt through turbines at the base of the dam. But ultimately, if we didn't have the sun creating evaporation to create clouds, we wouldn't have hydroelectric power either.
But is that like a renewable resource?
Yeah, yeah, in the same way that wind is. All of these forms of renewable energy, whether it's wind power, water power, etc., all of those things rely on solar energy heating the earth in some way. Wind is formed by uneven heating on the earth's surface. Water falling on landscapes is formed by water evaporating off of surfaces in the atmosphere, etc., etc. It's all one way or another, it's all solar energy of some type, if you think about it in broad scale of things. So ultimately, Salatin has created an economy that relies on natural inputs. This is the energetic way of thinking about Salatin's farm. On Monday, we will talk about thinking about Salatin's farm from the standpoint of nutrient cycling. Because while energy is a one-way flow through this thing, nutrients do get cycled within this. Nutrients on his farm do not have any external inputs. As a result, he relies on tight intrasystem cycling in order to keep his farm up and running. And that's what a lot of chapter 11 talks about. Questions?
With our food journals?
Yes.
Do you want us to just do the next?
Yeah,
2
just do the
weeks?
next week. I'll take them up next week, but I'll only be looking for a week of entries.
Okay.